this concept of lone offenders and small cells operating under leaderless resistance is the primary tactics domestic terrorists use here, both on the far left and far right. So my assessment is, given the current political and social climate that we're in, and as Rob had stated, the pandemic, the civil unrest, the economic downturn as a result of the pandemic, all of these things are playing into extremist recruitment and radicalization. And that's why I project that we're going to be seeing continued acts of violence, not only through the end of this year, but also into the next year. So like I said, lone offenders, they have a high degree of operational security. And what this means is they operate undetected because they're basically, self-training. They're choosing the targets of their own choosing. So unless the person's vocal about it or starts showing indicators through social media or things like this, it's almost impossible for law enforcement to prevent these lone wolf attacks. So it's important, Homeland Security set up a program. If you see something, say something, whether that's, a suspicious item left at the airport, or whether that's something on social media where someone's making calls for violence, or pictures that are being posted, or videos on social media showing somebody acquiring guns and issuing threats and things of this nature. So it's very important for law enforcement in the private sector to rely on social media monitoring. If you see something, say something for terrorist reporting, so that they can look into it to see if there's something more being plotted, more serious. So let's go ahead and talk about the landscape here in America of the types of extremists that have had histories of terrorism here in this country. We break these down into far right extremists, far left extremists, and then we have what's called single issue extremists. And I'm going to go over some examples of different movements that we've seen who've conducted violence on these various sections. So under the far right, on the political spectrum, these groups are generally extremely nationalistic. They're xenophobic. They don't like immigrants. And so that's where we see the white supremacists, these paramilitary groups called militias. Now we have these armed vigilante groups that fall on the far right that aren't quite militia groups because they're not conducting paramilitary training, but they're still organizing and showing up armed to these rallies and protests and trying to protect their communities, but also perhaps instigate something. We also have sovereign citizens. These are individuals who don't believe that they're a citizen of the United States, and therefore they rationalize they don't have to pay taxes, they don't have to register their vehicles, they don't have to follow government laws or regulations. Basically, they have Christian principles that they adhere to, and also the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments is pretty much all that they follow. And then we have this category of just general violent anti-government extremists. And these types of people are primarily conspiracy focused, and they're not really paramilitary in nature. So some examples of this would be the recent QAnon conspiracy theory, people that believe in that. We've had a couple of incidents over the past few years where people have heard of QAnon and some of the conspiracy theories associated with it, and actually went out and conducted criminal activity and stuff. One of the more popular cases was here in Washington, D.C., the infamous Pizzagate, where an individual from North Carolina came up with an assault rifle to this Comet ping pong pizza parlor, where the conspiracy theory said Democrats were plotting child abductions and there was a pedophile ring there and human trafficking and stuff. And he actually went into the place and thought there were children captive in this pizza parlor and actually shot up the place. And he was arrested. We also had a guy a couple of years ago drive an armored vehicle that he said was filled with explosives onto the Hoover Dam and disrupted traffic and basically had a standoff with police for several hours. He was also a QAnon adherent. So this is kind of the garden variety anti-government extremists that are, doing things violent or engaging in criminal activity. Now on the far left, we primarily have what's called violent anarchist groups or black bloc activists. These individuals, for the most part, historically have engaged in property destruction, but they've also attacked the police during protest activity and riots and things like this. But we're starting to see indications that these anarchists are now getting trained in firearms, and we had some recent shootings. One of them was at the Chaz autonomous region that was in Seattle. A bunch of anarchists had zoned off a section of the city and didn't have any police there or anything. There was a couple of fatal shootings there that involved violent anarchists. We also have violent black nationalists. These are people like the New Black Panther Party, the No Effing Around Coalition, this black militia that has recently formed. We also had a couple of black nationalists back in 2016, 2017 that killed police officers in retaliation for some controversial police shootings in Dallas and Baton Rouge. And then the third movement under the far left is the new Antifa extremists. And we haven't really seen, because they're kind of a new movement, we haven't seen a lot of violence other than property destruction and looting. But we did have an individual that adhered to the Antifa. This stands for anti-fascist. They're against Nazis. Gunned down a person that belonged to Patriot Prayer, which is another counter-protest group on the far right in Portland just a few weeks ago. And he ended up dying in a shootout with police a few days later. So lastly, we also have single-issue extremists. This can be on the far right or far left, but what makes them different is they focus exclusively on a single issue. So on the far right, we have anti-abortion extremists, the ones that blow up Planned Parenthood clinics and conduct arson attacks and shoot doctors. We also have violent tax resistors. These are people that are protesting various forms of taxes. In fact, one of the largest domestic terrorism attacks that we've had in this country was a vehicle bomb back in 1947 in Michigan, where he blew up a school full of kids and killed 47 children over a local tax issue. And then lastly, this is a fairly new movement over the past 4 to 5 years, and that's these violent male supremacists or incel extremists. Incel stands for involuntary celibate, and these individuals hate women and claim that, they're either, not attractive enough or they're too nerdy and women don't like them, and so they react violently and kill women. On the far left, the single issue extremists are primarily the violent environmental rights and animal rights extremists. So your Animal Liberation Front, Earth Liberation Front extremists. So that kind of gives you a rundown of domestic terrorism here in the United States and how they operate. So let's talk about what's been going on the past few months. There have been these three major shocks to our political and social system, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic, the related economic downturn associated with the pandemic. We have like 60 million people unemployed right now. A lot of those jobs may not come back in the foreseeable future. And then we have the civil unrest, these anti-racism protests that the extremists are now infiltrating and hijacking and conducting recruitment, radicalization, and even acts of violence under the cover of these Black Lives Matter protests. And then with the 2020 election upon us, a lot of these divisive, polarizing issues that I've been talking about are coming to the forefront, and people are using the election as a way to get their cause, increase visibility, as well as to try to influence government policy and influence voter turnout and things of this nature. So So let's talk about the far right first and what they've been doing at these protests and what my concerns are. So over the past 5 months or 4 months that we've been having this civil unrest, there's been a significant concern about outsiders coming in from other states to kind of agitate the situation or provoke other people or to encourage people to conduct violence, such as burning down businesses, destroying property and looting and things of this nature. Something that I have not seen until recently is disinformation campaigns being conducted by extremist groups. So they go in under the cover of being a BLM protester, but in actuality, they're a white supremacist or someone else that's trying to agitate or provoke the situation. We're going to go into more examples and stuff of this in a few minutes. The possessing of firearms at protests. This is something that started in around 2012, 2013 with the militias. They really showed up in force in Ferguson when we had the riots there in 2014. That's the first time we actually saw these paramilitary militia groups showing up to protect businesses, dressed up in tactical gear, bringing assault rifles and ammunition and guarding businesses and things of this nature. That's just only accelerated. And then we had Charlottesville in 2017, where people from both sides started bringing weapons, improvised flamethrowers, mace, knives, guns, you name it, shields, and got in a huge clash in 2017 in Charlottesville. And now, with this civil unrest, we're starting to see these mini Charlottesvilles erupting across the country where these two sides are intermingling and agitating each other, and it leads to these street fights and brawls. There's a lot of chatter on the far right about revenge and retaliation, especially in lieu of the Portland shooting by the alleged Antifa supporter killing the Patriot Prayer member, shooting him at point blank range. So there's talk and chatter about that's the first shot of the new civil war and we need to retaliate, revenge. And I'm afraid that both of those individuals, the victim, the Patriot Prayer victim, as well as the shooter who died at the hands of law enforcement, are going to become possibly these martyr figures for both sides. And people want to emulate and copycat what they do and do it on behalf or in memory of these people that were killed. So on the far right, as I discussed, there's always a bunch of sub-movements, but we're primarily talking about white supremacists and anti-government extremists. Multiple ideologies, for example, white supremacists can be neo-Nazis, KKK members, racist skinheads. We have Aryan prison gangs, groups like that. The anti-government's primarily these armed vigilantes as well as the militia extremists. So historically, and even within the past 10 years, the violence on the far right largely focuses on attacking people, okay, rather than property. And this is significant because for the longest time, at least for the past couple of decades, the far left has kind of abstained from killing innocent civilians, and even targeting, killing cops and stuff, but that's changed recently. So that's another thing that's concerning. On the far right, we have these two concepts, these key narratives. One emulates from the white supremacists called a race war. The other is civil war concept by the anti-government extremists. Both are very similar concepts. They want to instigate societal collapse and get these two extreme factions warring against each other, actually killing each other. And so, that is a particularly concerning thing when you have people that want to instigate or try to, bring about these types of things here in America. And that's exactly what they're trying to do with these civil protests. So some nicknames for the race wars, they call it RAHOWA, or Racial Holy War. In William Pierce's book, he was a prominent neo-Nazi leader, wrote a book called The Turner Diaries that inspired Timothy McVeigh to create a 2,500-pound truck bomb and blow up a federal building in Oklahoma City back in April '95. In that book, he called this race war the Day of the Rope. And there was a scene in the book where, as the race war would erupt, there would be all these blacks and Jews and homosexuals hung from the street lamps of all cities by the insurrectionists. So on the Civil War concept, we have this new movement called the Boogaloos, and basically they're an anti-government movement, a paramilitary type organization where people are trying to hasten this Civil War concept, try to, destabilize society and try to get the different sides to fight against each other. And we've had a number of attacks as well as plots that have recently been thwarted. And we'll talk about that in a few seconds here. A couple of other terms that the far right uses for this Civil War concept is when the shit hits the fan, or Teotihuacan, which is the end of the world as we know it. So if you're going through the propaganda or reading the different extremists web chats, you'll see those types of terms thrown around to allude to this Civil War concept. And same with the Boogaloos, they call it the Boog or the Big Igloo or the Big Luau. That's what they're talking about, is the Civil War that's coming, or that they're trying to create. So the far right has engaged in different types of activities during these civil protests. One is ideologically motivated violence or attempted violence. Again, they're using the cover of the protests to radicalize these people into thinking a civil war is upon us or is actually happening right now. And then people get paranoid or fearful about that, and then they act or react, and they go out and attack the police or something. Then we also have nonviolent actions by having a visible presence, bringing the firearms to the protests and under the auspices of protecting businesses or backing the police. But then again, like I said, they're harassing and intimidating and trying to provoke something, trying to silence the opposition with these firearms. And we saw how that could go bad with Kenosha as well as Albuquerque, the shootings that happened there. I mentioned the disinformation efforts. We're going to go into some more details about that. And then another topic that we'll go into some more detail is engagement with law enforcement, okay? Signs of infiltrating law enforcement and cooperating with them. We've had several incidents that have happened during these protests where that's actually happened, and it's concerning. The far left, to my knowledge, has not engaged in any disinformation efforts as of yet, and they have not engaged in any type of law enforcement infiltration or cooperation for obvious reasons. They believe that the law enforcement's racist, and they're expressing grievances against law enforcement. So this is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you kind of a sampling of the types of violence we've seen from the far right during these protests. We had in Oakland, California, a Boogaloo member who was also active duty Air Force, did a drive-by shooting at a federal building and killed a federal police officer that was standing guard and wounded another guard. A day later in Las Vegas, 3 Boogaloo members were stopped, and they had a cache of weapons, assault rifles, and Molotov cocktails and other types of things in the trunk of their vehicle. And they were arrested for attempting to instigate violence at a protest in Las Vegas. We've also had vehicle ramming attacks. There's been a lot of these that's hard to determine if there was an ideological motivation behind it, or whether the person just kind of stumbled across a bunch of people standing in the road and they got scared and just, accelerated through the crowd. But we do have at least 3 confirmed cases where a person did it deliberately because they either hated Black people or they didn't like the Black Lives Matter message. So the first of these happened in Pasadena, California. Unfortunately, there were no injuries in that attack, but this person had a couple of flags attached to their vehicle. One was the Gadsden Minutemen flag, which is commonly associated with the far right and anti-government type people. We also had a second one a day later in Bloomington, Indiana. This was a motorcycle, and this person was arrested and actually at least charged with a hate crime. There were 2 wounded in that vehicle ramming attack. The third happened in Virginia, and this one got a lot more media coverage because it was a KKK leader who drove through the crowd and hurt several people there. So anyway, on June 6th, this same Boogaloo guy that conducted the drive-by shooting in Oakland and killed the federal security guard and wounded another, police caught up to him and tried to arrest him, and they got in a shootout, and another police officer was killed, another police officer was wounded, and when the subject finally succumbed to his injuries, he wrote in blood various Boogaloo slogans on the vehicle that he was using to shield himself from the bullets from the police. So he was taken into custody and is in the hospital, and he'll be charged with these 2 different attacks. And then we have some protest shootings. Many of you already know about the Kenosha shooting. This was a young minor that responded to a militia's call to arms at Kenosha. So he wasn't really a militia member. He didn't belong to the group, but he monitored militia chatter and sympathized and supported them. And he responded to that call. And so that makes him part of the militia. And so basically towards the end of the protest, I guess he was confronted by some people and he started fleeing, and the people chased him, and he ended up shooting 3 people and killing 2 of them. And then lastly, we had on September 1st, 2 people arrested, both of them militia members from Missouri, who were traveling up to Kenosha, Wisconsin, to participate in the counter protests there. They were arrested at a hotel for attempting to instigate violence, because on their social media, they basically said, we're going up to Kenosha to start, picking people off and shooting people and stuff. So my tracking of this just through social media as well as news reporting, and this was a daunting task, and by no means is this a comprehensive look at what happened, but this gives you a snapshot. I tracked 134 unique events across 36 states and the District of Columbia where these far-right militias or white supremacists actually were reported there. 75 of them related to anti-government extremists, 23 related to white supremacists, and then we had another couple of dozen that pertain to other far-right groups like these armed vigilantes and stuff like that. Now, another organization that tracks far-right extremists, they had over 200 events that they plotted across the country. And so they did a nice kind of report on what the far-right was doing at these protests. So let's talk just briefly about this disinformation effort. So far, according to publicly available information, there was no foreign governments that were involved at this time that we know of. However, we do know of a few incidents where white supremacists and anti-government groups circulated false rumors, pretended to be BLM protesters, actually set up a Twitter account saying that it was Antifa and saying that, Black Lives Matter and looters and violent anarchists were going to come out to suburban cities across the country and loot and arson. And it got a lot of people up in arms and scared. Even law enforcement that was monitoring this Twitter account thought it was real. Come to find out, it was a white supremacist group that was running it, just trying to instigate things and get people to hate Antifa and leftists and things like this. The famous Umbrella Man that was filmed in Minneapolis on the first day of violence that broke out there. He was a guy, tall white guy dressed in black and had a black umbrella and took a hammer and smashed out all the windows of an AutoZone where a group of people had gathered near the shooting site of George Floyd, and encouraged people to go in and loot and set fire to this place. Well, he was filmed and followed by some of the protesters. And he was later identified as a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang called the Aryan Cowboys, which has white supremacist leanings. So that just goes to show you, he went into this civil unrest under the guise of being a BLM type protester and actually tried to instigate, violence and criminal activity. We also had a group of white supremacists in Richmond that posed as BLM protesters and incited a riot, actually caused people to riot there and attack the police. We also had a recent example in Weatherford, Texas, of white supremacists, 3 of them going around distributing Antifa type literature against white supremacists, when in actuality they were white supremacists just trying to get people in the community to get upset about the Antifa being in their neighborhood and stuff. And then in just past couple of days, we've had rumored Antifa looting and fire setting in these wildfires out in Oregon. And this caused a bunch of people to form some of these armed vigilante groups. They started setting up checkpoints, looking for these Antifa people, trying to protect their neighborhoods and whatnot. And the Sheriff's Department and the City Police of Medford had to actually issue notices on their Twitter accounts and Facebook saying that these rumors were not true. Antifa had not set these fires, and that there was no Antifa people reported looting. So again, it's just ways extremists are using to try to get people upset at their opposition that they want to get at. So the last thing I want to mention on the far right is their cooperation with law enforcement. And this is particularly disturbing, particularly in these times where law enforcement needs to be establishing trust with the communities they serve. And yet we've got, videos of them, giving congratulations and showing gratitude to these militias and people for showing up armed and protecting businesses, handing out water. We've had a couple of cases where actual 3% militia members were police officers and wore their patches on their tactical vests or their shields during the riots. So those people have been suspended and are being looked at and investigated. But basically the 4 types of activities that I've found between cooperation with law enforcement and far right is infiltration, coordination, meaning the police are talking to the militia to ask them to back them up if they get overwhelmed or protect property that they can't protect. Support in the forms of, congratulations or we appreciate you guys, things of gratitude. And then actual information tip-offs where police are telling the armed militia that, this is what we're going to be doing with the protesters. So you guys might want to set up over here and avoid this area because we're going to be arresting people over here, things like this. And so here's just a sampling of 10 events. We've had 2 or 3 more recently where we've seen this actual linkages between law enforcement cooperating with these far-right extremist groups. Now let's talk about the far left. As I told you, the 3 major movements that have showed up here at the protests are Black nationalists, these anti-fascists, Antifa, and summits and political conventions and stuff. I'm really concerned about this radicalization loop that I call it. So basically the far right is fearful of the far left, and so they start showing up armed. So then the far left gets fearful of the far right because they're showing up armed, so they start acquiring arms and showing up armed. Vice versa, threats being issued, street fights erupting between these 2 groups. When these types of things happen, the people that are participating in it, whether they witness it or whether they're actually involved in it, are being radicalized. They're seeing violence unfold between these opposing groups, and it kind of reinforces their ideology and their extreme interpretation of what's going on. And in some cases, it may lead somebody to plot or carry out a violent attack or some other type of criminal activity. There's also the potential for an arms race between these groups. For the longest time, the far right's been showing up time and time again with these long guns, assault rifles, pistols, and the far left has only brought shields and maybe some knives or something like that. So now they're forming gun clubs. They're conducting paramilitary training activities. I just told you about the No Effing Around coalition. Over 100 plus Black militants formed their own militia, and they showed up at Stone Mountain to counter-protest against white supremacists and anti-government people. But the far left, historically, at least for the past 20 or 30 years, has primarily been property destruction and attacking the police. They haven't really shot civilians or done things like that. But this has changed. Portland is an example of it. The Chaz shootings I told you about are examples of it. We also had right before the pandemic hit in February, we had a construction worker kill his supervisor because he was an advocate Trump supporter. And he actually, the person that killed him had some far left views and draped this guy with the American flag after he killed him. So it was ideologically motivated, this murder. Some of the key concepts and narratives on the far left are killing cops, police reform, all cops are bastards. You'll see this acronym ACAB and scrawled, graffiti tagging on a lot of protests and things like this. Burning up police cars, smashing the windows of the police station, things like this. So I've tracked, and nobody else has attempted to track this that I know of, at least from the, government think tanks that I look at. Everyone talked about the far right and it's present, but what about the far left? So I was able to find at least 42 locations. Again, this is just a sampling. I'm sure there's a lot more that I didn't discover. This is gathered through a little bit of social media monitoring, but primarily heavily on media reporting. So we had violent anarchists show up at least 28 unique locations. The Antifa, I knew of at least 8 locations, but of course, there are probably a lot more. And then we also had Black nationalists at least 7 locations. And this is kind of a graphical map. I kind of apologize for the background there. It's very light, but you can kind of see the cities and how many protests we were able to find them attending. Typically, the Pacific Northwest has been both a hotbed for far right and far left extremists. And so we see a lot more confrontations in places like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Oakland, things like that. So this is a sampling of the far left violence. Again, I think this is underestimated because I know there's a lot more arson activity that happened. There were a lot more police that were attacked. But this is just a sampling of the types of activities the far left has been arrested for. I also mentioned in July, the Department of Justice was called up to Congress, and a U.S. attorney testified that there were 300 plus domestic terrorism investigations opened since the civil unrest started in late May. So that gives you an idea that there's a lot of federal law enforcement investigations ongoing related to domestic terrorism that occurred during the civil unrest in May and June alone. 300 investigations. So a lot of those are being worked. Maybe suspects have been identified and yet to be arrested, or suspects have yet to be identified. So I think we're going to see a lot more in the days, weeks, months to come of these far left activists that participated in violent terrorist activity during the civil unrest. So we had a $20,000 looting and arson at a Target store in Austin back in May. We had an anarchist caught with Molotov cocktails, plotting an attack, calling for killing the police he was arrested in Massachusetts. Another anarchist actually instigated a riot and destroyed a police vehicle in Pittsburgh. We had 5 police vehicles arsoned in Tacoma. They arrested a black bloc anarchist female for that. We had a person arrested in July for an arson attack against a police car in New York City. We had a group claim responsibility for a lot of vandalism throughout downtown Philadelphia, as well as rioting and property damage. And then we had the Portland shooting, which I would call as kind of a galvanizing moment that's going to serve as a catalyst for more violence. So it's a watershed event that occurred, this gunning down of the Patriot Prayer protester by an Antifa supporter. And then we also had a vehicle ramming attack this month. Far left person saw somebody come out of a restaurant with a Patriot Prayer hat and jacket, and they drove their vehicle deliberately over the person. And then in Colorado Springs, we just had 3 members of the John Brown Gun Club, which is a group of violent anarchists from Seattle, part of the Puget Sound Anarchist Collective. They were arrested in Colorado Springs for attempting to escape violence, and they were convicted felons in possession of firearms. So this leads me to the forecast, and I'm going to wrap up my briefing here shortly. The forecast and what some recommendations are. So I've already told you, this unrest that's happened over the summer is going to continue into the fall, up to the election, even after the election and into the new year. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I believe that the election is going to be a prolonged process with the increased mail-in ballots and people voting remotely and not showing up at the polling stations. This is going to delay the vote count. There's going to be lawsuits filed by both parties in any contested area where vote counts are contested. That litigation will carry on probably into the new year. Some things that are concerning is the administration has been planting little seeds and ideas that the votes are going to be fraudulent, that the election is going to be rigged. So they're already kind of encouraging or setting up the stage for if Trump loses, it's going to be under these fraudulent pretenses, and that's going to agitate these anti-government and militia groups further. So I've already mentioned the rearming and acquiring firearms on the part of the far left. These calls for revenge and retaliation by the far right and to avenge the death of the Portland victim. We've had increased street fights and physical confrontations that have occurred. Just in the past couple of weeks, we've had these street brawls in Portland and Gresham, Oregon, Seattle, Stone Mountain, Georgia, Fort Collins, Tallahassee, Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Michigan, and other places that I didn't have time to research and include here. So we've already talked about that and how these allegations or predictions that the vote's going to be rigged and how that plays into people's paranoia and fear. So what can we do, or what does police and the elected officials need to do? First of all, we need to condemn unlawful, ideologically motivated violence on both sides. Okay, so some of you might be familiar, you heard in the news that President declared Antifa a domestic terrorist organization, which it is not. It's actually a movement of people, some of whom are peaceful, some of whom conduct acts of violence. But yet, for white supremacists that have killed people time and time again, he doesn't label them terrorists. So elected officials at all levels, local, state, and federal, including the president, need to call out and condemn ideologically motivated violence, call it terrorism, and call out the movements that are behind it. They also need to take greater care with their rhetoric and messaging. I've looked at extremist groups here in America since I was 15 years old, and I've studied it in college, and I turned it into a career and monitored it from the government's perspective for 25 years. And I've never seen far-right extremists thrive under a Republican administration until now. It's always cyclical. When Democrats are in power, it's the far-right extremists that get active and recruit and radicalize and conduct attacks because they're fearful the Democrats are going to ban guns or pass some sort of gun legislation or expand rights to minorities or gays and things like this. They have lax policies on immigration. These are all hot-button issues for the far right, and so that's why they operate at a heightened state during Democratic administrations. The same with the far left when Republicans are in power. They typically get more energized because the energy regulations are being laxed. Corporate CEOs are getting bigger tax breaks and things like this, and so it agitates people on the far left. But under this Republican administration, the far left is getting energized, but also the far right has continued to thrive, and it's just really concerning. There needs to obviously be structural policing reforms. Law enforcement entities need to remove extremists from within their ranks. Again, this undermines public trust in a time that you really need to instill trust in your communities. Having extremist police officers erodes that trust. Federal, state, and local law enforcement need to give a greater priority to investigating and preventing far-right ideologically motivated violence, which they've been reluctant to do for political reasons. Consider banning all weapons at these rallies. I mean, people shouldn't be bringing firearms, ammunition, illegal fireworks, incendiary devices, explosives. None of that should be at these protests. But unfortunately, we've kind of entered this age where people can form these protests without filing the paperwork and notifying the government that they're going to protest. They just have these spontaneous swarming of people through social media. So it makes it more difficult to set up a perimeter and checkpoints and search people as they go into the areas. But we need to find something, maybe just pass some laws that ban firearms at protests. And that way, people that are visibly showing firearms can be escorted away or arrested. The National Guard and federal law enforcement should augment state and local police. They shouldn't operate autonomously like they did in Portland, where, basically we had Customs and Border Protection tactical officers roaming the city in these unmarked vans and gathering up people off the street who were suspected of, conducting criminal activity or what have you. It should be a coordinated and, we're on the same team, play together. This cooperation between police and extremists. The police need to distance themselves from these far-right militias and vigilante groups, whether it's actual cooperation or perceived cooperation. All of this must end. And that concludes my briefing. So I'm going to open it up to questions, and I believe we have a moderator that's going to be fielding your questions. So I'll turn it back over to Rob.
Thanks, Daryl. Lots of interesting things. We have a lot of questions come in, so I'm going to try to summarize those quickly. And one I wanted to start off with, there's a question about this, and a question that we'd actually thought about beforehand was on July 4th, there were right-wing demonstrators that came to Gettysburg, to the battlefield, and to the cemetery in response to Antifa was going to be
rumors.
Rumors about that, which turns out it was actually kind of a left-wing hoax of that to do that. Could you just talk briefly about that situation, what you know about that situation, and how common that is?
Yeah, so I mentioned a number of disinformation efforts on part of the far right. So this would be an example that I can include in my next presentation of the far left agitating the far right. So we have seen this play out in communities across the country. Some things that were interesting that also have to deal with Pennsylvania is we actually had a caravan of BLM protesters traveling from Milwaukee down to Washington, D.C. And along the way, they made stops in the various states and got out and did a little march and a walk. In two communities in Pennsylvania, one of which was Clarion County, I forget where the others, these armed vigilantes confronted them and actually fired shots at these BLM protesters and intimidated and harassed them to the point they all got back in their cars and left. So, we're seeing a lot of this type of stuff. It's really hard to keep up with. There's so much of it going on. We're typically in a given year, if I was an analyst working at Homeland Security, I would see maybe, one or two incidents a month that I'd be tracking. Now it's like multiple incidents per day. And it's like, I can't even keep track of everything that's ongoing. But it's just an example. And Gettysburg has been used in the past when we had Gordon Young, the KKK leader, lives over here in Sharpsburg by me, held some protests there, some rallies to try to draw attention to the KKK and the Confederate cause and things like this. So it's just, ways that extremists are agitating each other and trying to draw attention to their causes.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions that I'm going to try to tie together here about how you separate, and you mentioned with Antifa not being a domestic terrorist organization, it's a more broad-ranging group than that. And there are questions about how do you, why are anarchists on the left, and how do we distinguish between what could be a protest movement versus an extremist organization?
Right. So that was something that I dealt with constantly during my government employment. We have regulations and restrictions in place to protect people's civil rights, civil liberties, privacy, and stuff like that. And, extremists are basically on the far fringes of both the political spectrum, both sides. And generally extremists, they don't have to actually be violent, but they belong to a movement that has shown a history of violence and making calls for violence and targeting faith-based communities and government and other institutions to try to implement social and political changes. So there is a delicate balance. As a private citizen, I don't have those same regulations that I have to follow, but I do still have a respect for people. There's people in the militia movement that are law-abiding, people that respect authority and just want to do good for their communities and maintain a defensive posture. What we get concerned about are the ones that want to plot and do something. We call that being on the offensive. So same thing on the far left. When you cross the line is when you destroy property, you set fire to businesses, you shoot people, these types of things. And as far as threats, I'm concerned about people that are threatening, organizations and groups of people. But from a police and intelligence perspective, you actually have to wait for that person to be specific in their threats. They have to actually name an institution and give the address or name a person and where they live. And that's kind of the line that gets crossed when it comes to law enforcement and intelligence scrutinies.
Thanks. We have a question about domestic terrorism and how it's a threat to the stabilization of the United States, but has not received the amount of media attention by the mainstream media. Your thoughts on why this is and what can be done to make the American public more aware of this?
Yeah, so why that is our government and the institutions around government and others have put out this message ever since 9/11 or even before that terrorism emanates from the Middle East. It's a person that, it embraces Islam, an extreme form of Islam. That's the message that the administrations time and time again have put out, and the media has followed that lead in showing. Same thing with, 9/11 kind of set this threshold. It was a spectacular mass casualty producing attack, and people equate that has to be the picture of terrorism. Hundreds of people have to be killed or affected. But terrorism, particularly on the environmental and animal rights side, has resulted in millions and millions of dollars of property destruction through violent crime of arson, but they've yet to kill people. But it's still ideologically motivated violence, so it meets that definition. And as far as what we can do about it, that's what I've dedicated my business and coming out from the shadows of working in the intelligence community to start educating the media, academia, and the public about terrorism in the United States, and that the different forms that it takes and the different movements that have brought it about.
Thank you. I think this will probably be our last question, so I'm going to try to wrap a couple of them in there. So you mentioned like banning weapons, fireworks, things like that at protests. And you also mentioned that for law enforcement, a lot of times they're have to be reactive, right? There has to be a specific threat. Can you talk about how that tension between citizenship, rights, and things like that that people have, and the potential for maybe even a backlash if you ban protests, would that just embolden, say, far-right groups? And to do that, how you kind of walk that fine line?
Yeah, so, I haven't been a police officer, but I've worked with police officers. I worked for a federal law enforcement agency, the ATF. And, there is that, delicate balance that the police officers have to exercise restraint. There's policies in place that they rehearse and practice and get trained on. They now have a lot better non-lethal weapons at their disposal, where back in the 60s they didn't have a lot of that, so they had to use other alternative means for crowd control and civil disturbance response. So it's generally, if people are there chanting and yelling and screaming, even if you're shouting, kill the cops or what have you, you're not really going to get a response from the police other than them staring back at you. It's when objects are thrown. It's when people get too close and try to break the perimeter line, things of this nature, that the police are then authorized use of comparable level of force to maintain control of the situation. But I will tell you, this is something that was done as like a secondary responsibility. It wasn't something on the forefront of law enforcement training. So there are some departments that are ill-equipped and ill-trained to deal with some of these things, and they overreact, and it gets caught on camera, and we get problems of that nature. So anyways, it's definitely something that police are trained to do, but in the situation and in the heat of the moment, mistakes can happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Daryl, for your remarks, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Students can use the link in the chat to join Daryl for a private conversation about national security careers immediately following this event. We'd also like to invite everyone to join the Eisenhower Institute at our Facebook page tonight at 7 p.m. to watch the live stream of the Eisenhower Memorial dedication with our staff and our community. Thanks again for joining us, and special thanks, Daryl, for sharing your expertise with us, and we hope to see you here again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.